The original Dead Space is a masterpiece of sci-fi survival horror. What's not to love about a spaceship overrun with space zombies with swords for arms? And by love, I of course mean be disgusted by and terrified of. But now it's creeping up on its 15th anniversary, and you know what that means: remake time. Now this isn't just one of those whack in some new textures and set it to a higher resolution remasters. No, this is a full, from the ground up, remake of the 2008 original, with a little bit of reimagining thrown in too. And it all manages to feel just different enough, and it's probably been just long enough since I played the original, that this remake somehow feels almost exactly like the game I remember playing, and also something that's completely new. You play as Isaac Clarke, who, with a small crew, arrived to investigate a distress call sent from the mining ship USG Ishimura. It's quickly revealed to be overrun with space zombies with swords for arms, and the plot revolves around A, finding out why there's space zombies, B, finding Isaac's girlfriend, and of course, C, getting the heck out of there.
We're all getting out of here.
It's great sci-fi horror, full of twists, conspiracies,
Shit like that's above my pay grade.
and a healthy dose of losing your mind, sprinkled with just a hint of a love story to give it a bit of humanity.
Nicole. I'm here. Nicole!
There has been quite a few tweaks and changes to the story though, with things like new side missions and logs, which all help flesh out the world and characters. But one of the biggest changes is that Isaac is now a fully voiced character.
Sir? Nicole?
Yeah. First deferred from her in weeks.
It's a potentially controversial change since he was a silent protagonist in the original, but I think it's been handled perfectly. Now, I almost can't imagine Dead Space without him speaking, and it's great to hear Gunnar Wright, who voiced Isaac in Dead Spaces 2 and 3, reprise the role.
I'll handle it. Just make sure there's power to the repair systems.
And for those worried that he's suddenly going to be yapping in your ear all the time, fear not. Isaac mostly only speaks when spoken to, and where it makes sense. During gameplay, he's thankfully still largely silent. So don't worry, he doesn't kill the tension. The standout new feature is of course the new graphics. The original Dead Space was a good looking game back in the day, but graphics have come a long way. And the claustrophobic, corridor crawling horror of the Ishimura has been absolutely transformed. There's a lot to admire here, from little visual effects like how sparks have their own lighting and physically interact with objects, to the insane level of detail packed into every nook and cranny. It all adds in so much more texture to the excellent environmental storytelling. Not to mention, it's an absolute masterclass in using lighting, or the lack thereof, along with atmospheric fog to create a stunningly horrific sci-fi atmosphere. The gameplay fundamentals are mostly untouched though, but have thankfully aged quite well. For those new to the series, it's pretty classic third-person survival horror, with limited inventory space and the need to constantly scavenge for resources. You can equip up to 4 weapons at a time, which are all satisfyingly industrial. There's plasma cutters, hovering saw blades, giant freaking lasers, an ever trusty flamethrower, and of course some kind of sci-fi shotgun. Many of the guns now have different secondary fire modes, which I think work a lot better than some of the originals. I personally enjoyed the Force Gun's new gravity well, which complements its wide short-range attacks, and the flamethrower's flame wall is great for blocking off areas. Isaac also has 2 very handy powers, Kinesis and Stasis. Kinesis lets you freely grab and throw any item in the world, and you'll be using it to solve puzzles and bypass environmental dangers. And of course, it can be used as a very satisfying weapon in its own right, letting you hurl explosive barrels, or anything else you can rip up. Stasis meanwhile lets you temporarily slow things in place, which is especially useful for getting through fast-moving obstacles and hordes of monsters without being shredded alive. Dead Space's combat has always had a fun, gory twist. Headshots and body shots do very little damage, so you'll need to remember to dismember. Taking off legs will slow monsters and buy you precious breathing room, while freeing them of their sword arms gives you a potential weapon to fling back at them. And we all love a bit of ammo conservation, don't we? This remake has added a gory twist on top of that gory twist, as weapons now strip away flesh and muscle from monsters' bones. It's a disgusting but effective piece of visual feedback. There's also a varied menagerie of monsters that will keep you on your toes throughout the adventure, all forcing you to constantly mix up your battle tactics. It's super gruesome, weighty, and visceral combat that I personally find immensely satisfying. But let's not unpack the psychology of that. Of course, speaking of psychology, good horror should be just as much about fighting the fear in your head as the monsters in front of you. And Dead Space is an absolute master at making you more afraid of the things you can't see than those you can. Because monsters can come out of anywhere, you'll never feel safe. And after you realize they always pop through these vents, you'll be paranoid to walk past them for the entire game. There's a brilliant pacing between encounters too, giving you just enough time to catch your breath and let that fear build up again before they hit you with more scares and combat. That pacing is now controlled partly through a system they call the Intensity Director, that can amp up or relax things depending on how you're playing, adding in more or less enemies, and even changing things like lighting and fog, which is a great feature to keep you guessing playthrough after playthrough. And it's all made truly terrifying thanks to the excellent sound design. The unnerving sounds of scuttling through vents and the creaking ship constantly had me checking my back. I jolted upright at more than a few jump scares from things as simple as showers turning on. I absolutely love exploring the Ishimura. It feels like a believable ship, with each area serving a purpose. You will be doing a fair bit of backtracking, but I actually enjoy that, as it creates more of a sense of being a real, explorable, lived-in space, rather than a series of linear corridors and rooms. And it's all seamlessly connected with no loading screens. There's trams and elevators to mask loading, but you're never waiting long. Another substantial change is that zero-gravity sections have been reworked to allow for full 3D movement, compared to the original, which just let you jump between floors. It's definitely an improvement, but it can be a bit easy to turn yourself around, and I did wish there was a way to move straight up and down. As is, you kind of just have to point where you want to go and move forward, which felt a bit cumbersome. The map has also been reworked, so it's now 2D to make it easier to read. And while it is easier to read, I think I prefer the old 3D one, as it just let me see how floors and areas were connected a little better. There's a lengthy list of other changes which would take me way too long to go through, but I'll list a few quickly. Weapons have some new special upgrades, there's now no blank upgrade nodes, and there's also now this security clearance system across the ship, which makes going back to explore earlier areas a bit more worthwhile. But I won't harbour on the details of every minor change. I'll just say that everything felt like it was a smart addition, adding some depth without feeling out of place or bolted on. For anyone who's never played Dead Space, this remake feels like a thoroughly modern action horror game that is an absolute must-play. And for returning fans, it manages to walk that line of hitting all the beats you remember, but being different enough to make it feel like you're walking the Ishimura's halls for the very first time. This is one beautiful recurring nightmare that I didn't want to wake up from. Play.